So let's begin. And just once more for the recording, actually, let's do this once more. Let's talk about where to find my office and where to find CASA. So here's a top-down view of the University College, and we are here in this building here, I believe, or this part of the building, the southeast corner. CASA and my office are here at the northwest corner. And the easiest way I know of getting there is going through a doorway right here. So you'll just go to the northwest corner of the University College, go through a doorway, and there's a stairway up. So CASA's on the third floor, I'm on the second floor. You can also get there. So if you're coming from this classroom, which is approximately here, you go down the hall and out a door just past the art museum, and there's kind of a covered walkway across the quad, and you'll see right here the F door. There's a door with F on it. You go through that doorway, and then again, up the stairs. So that's where they are. The members of CASA have asked me to remind you that they are, in fact, undergraduate volunteers. They are not getting paid a dime. They are undergrads like you. So they're doing their very best to provide you support, but they're doing it on a fully volunteer, out of the goodness of their heart basis. Please be very nice to them, because they don't have to help you if they don't feel like it. I have to help you, so if you need extra help, I'm a good person to talk to. I'm actually getting paid for this process. So talk to me if you need extra help beyond what they're capable or willing to provide to you, and be as nice to them as you possibly can, because they are genuinely just doing this because they're nice people. And I think I said this before, totally unprecedented in my experience that a student group would just band together and spontaneously provide support to a course. I've taught in 3 different departments, 4 if you count UTM's philosophy. I've never seen anything like it. So all gratitude to CASA, and please treat them with kindness and respect. I hope that you have been. Right, so welcome back after test 2. Everybody okay? How are the essay questions? Were they unexpected? Were they roughly what I hope I broadcast to you almost exactly what they'd be like? That was my goal. The point of that was not to give you a surprise ambush essay question. It was to give you, but nonetheless, write something. Obviously, I'm not looking for like essays of the scale and quality of your, the ones that you wrote at home where you had Google. Probably there's going to be a wide variety in the structure of the essays. I hope that, I believe I ended all 3 of them with the phrase argue for something. I hope you argued for something. But beyond that, I'm going to be very open-minded about what the structure of these things is going to look like. I know that you're writing these under rather severe duress. So don't worry about what you did just yet. After your marks come back, maybe then you can worry. But so there's going to be the exam is going to be the same structure as the second test. So there's going to be some short answer, and I believe there's going to be 1 essay question that you'll answer. Traditionally, there's 2, but I suspect that's too much. 2 essays is too much to write in 3 hours. So I'll give you some short answer, an essay. It's going to be 3 hours, so you have more time to deal with it. Just means the expectations will be a bit higher. So now you've seen what the exam is going to be like, exact same structure. So the exam and then the final essay, those are the last things to do in this course. Yeah, question. Good, okay, so let's talk about the final essay. Yeah, let's do that. So I'm not going to be posting topics for the final essay. The final essay, the topic is for you to determine. It's got to be something relevant to this course. That's why I included part of the rubric, like integration of course content. I don't want to see an essay that you wrote from some other class. I don't want to see an essay that shows me 0 evidence that you were in this class or paying attention to this class. That's a bad thing. Other than that, the topics are wide open. It can be from any part of the course. It doesn't have to be from the second half. Typically, people choose to do a more philosophical final essay. So the first essay was more in the psychology of things. I'm kind of looking for things more on the philosophy side of things for the final essay. But if you want to do a psych paper again, get in touch with me, run it by me, and we'll talk about it. it's a bit, I mean, other than that, it's a bit longer. The format's going to be the same kind of APA formatting. I still want an abstract. I would still like in-text citations. I'll remind you of this closer to the date, but one thing that I forgot to emphasize, I think I put it on the syllabus but didn't talk about it in class, I would really like page numbers on your citations. So by and large, people were really good about providing in-text citations. That is, I knew which paper your ideas were coming from, and that's great. I would like you on the final essay to go one step further. Tell me not just what paper the idea is coming from, but what page in that paper the idea is coming from. This is helpful to me because it's easy to find where your claims are coming from. It's also helpful to you because sometimes I get to a part in your paper where I'm like, that can't be what they said. That doesn't sound right to me. And then I go look it up, and it is in fact what they said. You were accurately reporting what the people were saying. I just don't believe what they were saying. So that's not a you problem anymore. That's a some other person problem. And it's no fault of yours that they said something that I don't agree with. So giving me page numbers helps smooth out that process. It helps make sure that I'm not blaming you for somebody else's weird idea. So that's, I mean, it is also part of the point of citation. So the point of citations is for me to be able to tell where the idea is coming from and be able to check, like to be able to really ground what you're saying and what somebody else has said. So that process gets even better if you give me page numbers. Some of you did, many of you didn't, and I think I didn't emphasize it in class, so I didn't penalize anybody for not doing that. On the final essay, I'm gonna kind of insist on it. So you can't just tell me like, it came from a book. Yeah.
On the essay, I don't think you docked any points for it,
Yeah.
but I think we looked at two different articles. Because I think the one I looked at was the journal, so it had the journal page number.
Yeah.
And the one you looked at had like the article page numbers. I think that's what happened. So
Okay.
would it be beneficial if I do like a hyperlink on my bibliography so you can go to the exact source I did?
So is this on the issue of page numbers?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think I remember what this issue was. So on the issue of page numbers, and thank you for attempting to give me page numbers. Very often there'll be, so in the citation it'll say like page 482 to 495, and then people, it wasn't just you, there's a few people who said this is on page 2, and those numbers don't match up, and those numbers should match up. It's not, from my perspective, a big deal, but what I do want to do in the kind of broader academic conventions, if your bibliography says this starts on page 487, if that number is 2, that's incorrect. That's the incorrect number. So you're giving the reference within the journal. This is like a holdover from when journals were all printed, and you needed that number to be able to flip through the actual physical journal to find where it was. So you're not telling me that, what I prefer is don't tell me the page of the PDF that you're looking at, tell me the page. So usually you can, there'll be page numbers in the PDF, and you look at the page numbers printed within the file rather than what's being listed on the thing. Is that what happened? Like,
I think it was two different sources. So
okay.
Mine was like a page in the journal, but I think there was like
Page in the journal.
Yeah, so like it was page like 1,342 or
Uh-huh.
and I think like the article listed as different page numbers.
Okay. So, okay, yeah, and sometimes there can be different places where the same article is published, so they'll come up with different numbers. So the game is just make sure that the numbers in your bibliography match up with the numbers that you're citing on the in-text citations. So I should be able to look at the bibliography and say, yes, so your in-text citation tells me it's page 1052. It should be within those ranges that the bibliography tells me that the article exists. And it's okay if it's, yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, this is, some of these conventions I'm doing because of our specific circumstances in this class. Some of them I'm trying to train you in the broader academic convention so you don't leave my class and be like, well, Corey said this was fine. Why are you giving me trouble for it now? So there's a kind of mixture of things that I subscribe to for good reasons and things that are just sort of arbitrary conventions from back when journal articles were printed on mushed up trees with ink. Yeah. Okay, so yes, you should be starting to think about your final essays now. So now that we've made it through test 2, all we've got left other than that is the exam. Yeah, so now would be a very good, if you haven't already started at least thinking about it, now would be a really good time to start thinking about your final essay. Yeah?
Do you know when the final exam is?
I do not yet know when the final exam is. It's not posted yet, right? I've been watching, I don't think it's posted yet. So, and they don't tell me ahead of time either, so yeah. So we're all waiting to find that out. Yeah. I will attempt to get you, as usual, I'll try to get your test back to you as quick as I can. My goal is Thursday of next week. It may go to Tuesday of the week after, so 2 full weeks after the test. My partner just moved into my apartment, so I'm currently living amongst many boxes and assembling things from IKEA and such, so thank you, yeah. So I will do my very best to get them back to you as soon as I can, as soon as I get my personal life sorted out, or amongst sorting out my personal life. Yeah. Other questions about the final essays? Like, I strongly encourage you to get in touch with me about your topic. I can help you. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to help you structure it. I'm happy to help you find sources or think about how to find sources, all of that stuff. I'm especially happy to help you. So one of the challenges is going to be coming up with a question that you can manage to write an essay on. That's really, really hard, and that's the kind of philosophy of this all. I think that's what, I mean, once you strip away the kind of scholastic pedantry of it all, that's the best thing about philosophy, is that it's the art of coming up with really good questions. And that's something that that's one of the reasons that I'm imposing this horrifically ill-defined problem on you of coming up with your own topic, forcing you to do some philosophy in that sense, in the sense of trying to think about what you find interesting and important. I'll give you the general advice that I always give people about how to choose a topic. You want to follow, so this is a nice example of the ways in which value and emotion is relevant to cognition. You should pick a topic that either, as Marie Kondo says, sparks joy, that you really love, that really motivates you, or pick something that makes you angry, something that's bothered you, something that really irritates you, either in the broader literature or something that we've done from this class or something that I've said, because the struggle here is to stay motivated through the process. That's the really hard part. And if you pick something you find absolutely banal and uninteresting, that's just extra effort that you have to put in. So it should be something that you care about in some sense, maybe not too much. So you maybe want to don't pick the topic that is the most dear and central to your entire being, unless you're ready to manage quite a lot. And do be aware of, so when you're planning out your essay, I recommend you schedule in the following process. Here's a thing that happens to me almost every time I write something, and very many people report it as well. You got a topic, you're doing your research, you're putting it together, you're halfway through writing it, and then something bizarre happens. Your essay leaps up at you like an animal, and it's something tells you, something in your essay convinces you that everything that you've written is worthless and confused. Your essay kind of like, it kicks back at you and it falls apart and all the pieces scatter all over your room, and you're like, now I have to start from absolutely nothing, like I have to start from scratch. This indicates that you are about half to 2/3 the way through the writing process. That's a good marker to tell you that you're past halfway, you're not quite done yet, but what I recommend that you do in those cases is first, take a calming walk, reflect on your life, but second, you can make moves like the following. So here's a really powerful move that you can make. So try to isolate your objection. Try to isolate what it is that the thing that makes you feel like the whole thing is falling apart, and ask yourself, can I just bracket this? So you can use a phrase. Here's a really powerful phrase. This is outside the scope of this paper. Okay? So there's an objection. You think everybody will see immediately that this objection is completely devastating and makes everything that I've said meaningless. Well, that's probably not true. That's probably, it seems larger to you than it is. What you can do is say, look, here's an objection that you might have to my paper. I'm not going to talk about it because I need to just finish this thing, right? So no paper encompasses the entire question that it's dealing with. There's just never been a paper that completely cleaned out a question entirely. I've read a lot of them. I've never seen one like that, even at the very people at the absolute top of the academic game. So use this phrase. Look, I recognize that this is an important question, but I'm not going to talk about it because it's outside the scope of this paper. Okay? Here's another thing that you can do. You can just put a negation at the end. You can just put brackets around the whole paper and put a negation sign out of it. So you say, look, here's an argument that looks really good for the following conclusion, but it fails for this reason. You just roll the problem into your thesis at the very end. You say, look, this argument that looks really powerful doesn't actually work for this reason. And then you just go back and rewrite your intro and your abstract. You say, look, here's why this argument looks, although it looks very promising, to me 3 weeks ago, it doesn't work for the following reasons. You explain the reasons, and then that's your paper. So 2 moves you can make. You can either just bracket out, you can say, look, this is an important objection, but I'm not going to deal with it. Or you roll the objection into your paper and say, look, here's a good argument against this thing that I thought 2 weeks ago. That happened to the first chapter of my thesis was exactly like that. I was like, I had an elaborate argument for position X, and then I had a devastating objection occurred to me, and then I just wrote the devastating objection as the answer to the question. Yeah.
So say like you're writing, your point doesn't have a full conclusion to, in the sense that there's no good answer here. You're attacking something that people seem to have kind of a bias towards, like, oh, this is how it is, this is how it works. And you instead present evidence that says, no, maybe this isn't how it works. This isn't the whole story. Like, how would you go about that?
That's, I mean, just exactly the way you just described. You say, look, I'm not giving you, so it's crucially important the way you frame your thesis. So this is your thesis statement is the sentence or sentences that you should spend the absolute most time on in your paper. And you should write them absolute last, right? The abstract is the last thing you should write. And then the second last thing is the intro where you give your full thesis statement. And what you say is something like, here is some evidence in favor of this position, without saying, I have proven to you for once and all that this is the correct position. Those are 2 extremely different claims, and the evidence that you bring to bear just needs to be proportionate to the claim that you're making. So it would be very surprising to me if anybody in a second-year undergraduate class completely convincingly established the conclusive answer to any of the things that we've been dealing with. That would be surprising. If it happens, I'll try to co-author a paper with you or something. You know, like I'll just steal credit for your great ideas. The much more likely is that you're going to offer an argument which moves the rational position in the direction of some position. And that's a much easier claim to establish. You say, look, I've given you some arguments, some useful arguments that can help move the conversation in this direction. And that's not to say that there's not any. So that claim doesn't pretend that there's no arguments that could be mounted against your argument. It doesn't pretend that you've addressed all of the relevant arguments. It's just saying, look, this is a contribution to this discussion. So the way that you deal with this is to just make sure that your thesis statement is proportionate to the moves that you're making, to the evidence that you can bring to bear. And just don't claim that you have proven absolutely and forever something that you haven't. One more recommendation. I think of it as conditionalization. I think that's my term for it. But if you need a big, hefty assumption to make your paper work, and you don't have time or space to defend it, what you do is make your paper of the following form. Say, if we assume this, then I can show you that. So it's a conditional statement. If this, then that. So you can pack as much as you want into that if part of it, right? You can say, look, if the GoFi perspective is correct and we're all just machines and blah, 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 like even you can make it as implausible as you want. It doesn't have to be a well-established thing for you to show that if that's true, something follows. So make your paper, if you find yourself assuming a whole lot of stuff and when it kicks up at you, you're like, oh my God, I haven't proven all this really important stuff that I've assumed, then that's evidence that you should just do the following. You should say, okay, I'm just going to collect all that stuff up and make it part of the if part of my thesis. If I assume this stuff, then this stuff follows, right? So these are all just strategies for dealing with the, I don't want to say inevitable, but extremely common mid-paper writing personal crisis. It happens a lot. If you're not used to writing, it's particularly bad because typically people just blame themselves and think that this process is a disaster. So don't do that. Know that this is a standard part of writing. Talk to me if that happens to you. Talk to me if you'd like. We'll have great sympathy for you because this happened to me a lot. Yeah. Okay. Other questions about this stuff? Yeah. Okay. So just to review, 3 strategies for dealing with when you're the situation where your essay jumps up at you like an animal and smashes all the work that you thought you'd done. You can bracket. You can say, this is beyond the scope of this paper. You can negate. You can just do the flip. Like in various martial arts, they just use the opponent's energy against them. Your essay's coming at you and say, yes, essay, you're right. That whole argument was wrong for the following reasons. And you probably have a very vivid sense of why your essay is completely wrong. Just use that. Just be like, look, here's an argument in the literature. It's incorrect for the following reasons. And finally, you can do the conditionalization. You could say, oh my God, I've assumed too much. I've assumed all this controversial stuff that I haven't proven. Just pack that into the if part of the thesis and say, what I'm showing is if this is true, then this follows. Okay? Okay. So yeah, please do run your essays by me if you're so inclined. I'm happy to give you comments, happy to sort of like say, yes, that does sound like an essay for this class. Yeah. And contact me at any point during the writing process. I can't read whole drafts. That's what I can't do. I can't read, there's still like 45 people in this class. I can't read 45 drafts, unfortunately. But if you give me an outline, I can comment on your outline. If you want to meet, we can meet, talk about it in person, that kind of thing. Okay. Oh. Okay. Good? Good. So, where were we? We've been talking about the simulation problem. This question of how do we know if we built an artificial intelligence that it is in fact a real instance of intelligence rather than a simulation? Because you can't do the kind of science that we want to do with AI if you're just dealing with a simulation of intelligence. You need the real article, right? You can't make inferences from the structure of something that's just pretending to be intelligent to the structure of our intelligence, which is one of the things that we wanted to do. You can't generalize over all of the kinds of intelligence that we found in the universe if one of your instances is just pretending to be intelligent. So what we need is some way of separating out the two. Yeah, Constantine, yeah.
There seems to be kind of a careful balance between multiple realizability and simulation problems.
Right.
If you have a copy or if you have something that you can make copies of, is that still technically the original? Because I hate to use play here, it has some essence that gets preserved in it across all different kinds of mediums.
Yep.
What you care about isn't changing, but you've got multiple things that seem to all have that.
Well, I mean, we copy ourselves. Presumably, that's not a dilution of our intelligence. That's just a multiplication of it.
I'm thinking of a story. You can have a story, it's multiply realizable.
Yeah.
Print or text or film, whatever.
Yeah.
But which one do you consider that the original? Is it the story? Is it the film version? How do you decide?
Oh God, I'm having flashbacks of the course that I got the lowest mark on, which is postmodernism, post-structuralism. I got a D in postmodernism, post-structuralism. I wasn't pleased with that. Actually, at the time, I was very pleased with myself because I was a little jerk. But so these are questions about what's the original. I don't know if there are good answers to that, to be honest. Baudrillard says the world is a series of simulations with no original, or copies of copies without originals. Yeah. So with the case of a story, every copy of the story is just as much, a written text, every copy is just as much the story, right? Yeah, yeah. So in that sense, if it's multiply realizable, each instance is as real an instance as every other instance. And then the hope is, of course, that intelligence is multiply realizable. That's the key thing here. Yeah.
It seems like the requirement to represent a story in something like a book. Like if you had no idea, kind of like the Chinese room experiment of like what this book said, and you were just trying to copy the meaning and then realize that's something else. Like you would have to first know what those symbols meant inside the book that produced the story, and then to realize it was something else.
Okay. So you're just giving me essentially another version of the problem that so you're re-articulating the problem that we're talking about here, which is precisely when is it the real article and when isn't it? And so let's do that you're giving me like a broad version of it. Let's focus today just on the cognition version of it. Okay. So we talked about the Turing test last time, which is a kind of test of indiscernibility. That is, when can you tell whether the thing is intelligent? Can you tell whether the thing is intelligent or not? And we talked about how Leibniz gives us this rule about when two things are the same kind of thing, when you can't tell them apart. Turing test seems to be an instance of that, so that's nice. But of course, we questioned this pretty deeply, and we asked, hey, like, why is it the typing part of intelligence that's the most important? Why are the bits that come across a keyboard the essential bits, and everything else literally gets screened off? Like there's a physical screen between you and the other thing, and you're screening off everything except the bits that you can type on a keyboard. Why is that? Other than the fact that Turing made his life, his living at a keyboard, so to him it was very important. I sympathize. I make my living mostly at a keyboard as well. That doesn't seem like a principled answer to the question, does it? And we saw some philosophical complaints about this in, for example, Searle's Chinese room argument. So notice that the Chinese room thought experiment is exactly analogous to the Turing test, right? What we're saying is there's identity of behavior, identity of total output, right? So the indiscernibility of the total output of the system from an intelligent agent. And in the Turing test, Turing was saying to us, look, this is good enough as a test. Searle wants us to think that no, that's not good enough. Just identity of output is not good enough. And we wrestled through a whole bunch of versions of the Turing test, various philosophical considerations. I won't bore you with all of that again. What I want to kind of distill this down to is the following question. So what we've been wrestling with, what we've been aiming for, trying to come up with, is a criterion of the cognitive. So what is it that makes something a cognitive process? Or another way of saying that, what's the mark of a cognitive process? How do you tell when a process is genuinely cognitive and when it's not? Note that this question is less rigorous than the question we've been asking all along. So we've been shooting down theories left and right because they're not complete theories of cognition. It's a very high bar that we've been operating with. This is a relatively lower bar. Like, having a criterion of the cognitive is not the same as having a complete theory of cognition. It's just knowing what a theory of cognition is supposed to do. This is literally just trying to come up with the goal state for a theory of cognition rather than having the theory in hand. So we don't even have, at this point in the story, a clear picture of the goal of like, this is cognitive science. We're supposed to be doing the science of cognition. Until we have a criterion of the cognitive, we don't even have a clear description of the goal state for our science. And this is something to keep in mind. Anytime one of the sort of famous Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson says you don't need to do philosophy, science can tell you all the answers. Well, science can maybe tell you the answer, but only after somebody has figured out the question. And you cannot go into the world and scientifically discover questions, right? There's no questionometer that you can just point at the world and it discovers the relevant questions for you, right? Science can tell you the answer once you have a clear and well-crafted question, not before. The scientific method has very little to do. Do you know what Karl Popper says about the process of coming up with questions? This is a famous philosopher of science. He says, who cares? Not my business. That's psychology. How do people come up with questions? Who cares? They dream them up. They drop acid and see them in the fire. Doesn't matter. Really, like his principle in the logic of scientific discovery, his principled philosophical answer to the question of how do you come up with a question is who cares? Well, I disagree. I think the process of coming up with scientific questions is a hugely important one, and that's exactly where philosophy happens. He was one of the logical positivists who were kind of like begrudging philosophers. They're like, hey, can we just not do this philosophy thing? And I think the answer that history came up with was actually, no, we have to. We have to. So one potential answer to this question that we're going to explore before the end, and I've been kind of laying the groundwork for this all semester, and we're going to come back to it at the end, maybe a criterion of the cognitive that we might take seriously is the idea that the ability to figure out what's relevant is what makes an agent cognitive. So what makes the difference between something that's just pretending to be a cognitive agent, a simulation, and the real thing, maybe it's the capacity to, as they say, realize relevance in the sense of realizing what is relevant and also sort of generating a sense of relevance. That seems to have been the problem, didn't it, with a bunch of the psychological theories that we're facing. So when we're trying to understand the various cognitive capacities that we have, we kept getting stymied by this problem of relevance, sort of brought together in a philosophical package in the frame problem, right? So we kept running into the problem of relevance like a wall. Maybe the thing to do is, rather than consider it an obstacle to understanding, actually consider it the goal. So the goal maybe of cognitive science, the criterion of the cognitive, might be working out what's relevant in some broad way. Just a thought. Okay, so let's dig in. Let's dig in even deeper, because that wasn't abstract and weird enough. I can tell. You're all like, oh, geez, this is all concrete and specific. What's going on? Let's do some philosophy of mind. So even more broadly, notice, so we haven't really talked about these rather deeper questions. So we talked about the criterion of the cognitive. Cognition is one thing that a mind does, but maybe we should ask what minds are in general. So what is a mind? What are minds? And today we'll spend some time asking, what are minds made of? This has come up, but like, what is the substance of a mind? And here's something that kind of surprising that we didn't propose this. So what is consciousness? Presumably we're all conscious. I'm looking around, none of you are fully asleep. It's good. So, but what is that? These are going to be the topics that we'll deal with today and next class. Interesting that we didn't, so when we're thinking about the criterion of the cognitive, we didn't mention consciousness. It does seem like not a terrible answer either, right? Consciousness might have something to do with it. Of course, because relevance is the center around which this entire course swirls, I'm going to make the case that consciousness has something to do with relevance. But you might also think that being conscious is a nice criterion of the cognitive. So when are you just pretending to be cognitive and when are you really cognitive? Well, you might say when you're conscious, when you have a full conscious awareness. And that's what's missing from the Chinese room, isn't it? So nowhere, it does not seem to be anywhere in the system that there is consciousness. Maybe that's what's missing. But then, boy, that's a tricky answer, because what is that? It's not much of an answer, right? If you can't tell me what consciousness is, it's not much of an answer to the deep philosophical question of what cognition. What's cognition really? Well, that's when there's thinking accompanied by consciousness. What's consciousness? No idea. Yeah. So, so let's dig into these as questions and try to get some clarity on them. At least we can look at some of the issues that have been brought up around them in history, so we don't fall into some old historical traps of thinking about them. That might hopefully be helpful. As always, we start with Aristotle. Why do we do that? Because probably colonialism, if I had to guess. It's a good bet for most questions of that form. In Aristotle, and in fact in most philosophical traditions throughout history, there is no question about the relationship between mind and body, or at least it's a perfectly solvable question. Recall the thing that Aristotle said. So recall the very different, what I'm gonna do right now is work us up into the historical position of being trapped in what's called the mind-body problem. So we'll start before it, and then we'll fall into the deep well of despair that is the mind-body problem. So let's start just before it happened, right? So remember this thing I said about Aristotle, that he's got this distinction between matter and form, right? And for Aristotle, matter is not yet a thing, a thing with independent sort of existence. Matter is just kind of this potential, right? A piece of wood is the potential for a chair or a ship or a picture frame, right? It's just the potential to be something. What makes it actual is the marriage of matter and form. When matter and form get together, then you have something that's actual. So you give it a shape. The chair is actually a chair because it's got the material of matter combined with the form, the structural functional organization of a chair. So form gives matter its substance, in the sense of substance for philosophers means the kind of independent existence, a thing which can exist in and of itself. Okay. For Aristotle, why am I telling you this? Because it's about his story about what the mind is. So Aristotle holds a position called hylomorphism about the relationship between form and matter. He says neither matter nor form are real without the other. It's the combination of the two which makes something. Both are potentials, and they're only actual when they get together. So here's a story about how the mind and the body are related. The soul, psyche, is the form of the body, and the body is the matter informed by the soul. So your mind is the structural functional organization that gives form to the pure potential of your body, your material body. So in this case, there's no distinction between mind and matter in the way that we come to believe that there is in the era of Descartes. So they're no more separate than the shape of the chair and the wood that the chair is made of, right? Those two things are inseparable in that object. Without them in combination, the object just isn't the thing that it is. Similarly, your mind and your body are not separate things. Your very existence depends on the combination of the two. So let me be clear. Your existence as a rational agent depends on the combination of the two. Okay, so these are not deeply separate things for Aristotle. They are profoundly interconnected things. Similar in almost every other tradition that I'm aware of throughout the world. If you look at traditional Chinese medicine, for example, the body and the mind are one. There's not a profound separation between the two. If you look at traditional European medicine, you see the exact same thing. So if somebody is too aggressive or too excited, that's an imbalance of your humors. These are fluids pumping around your body, right? So your humors are both mental and physical aspects. When they talked about somebody's moral fiber, they were speaking literally. Your morality is a fact about the physical fibers of your body, right? So traditional European medicine also had this like deep intertwining of mind and body. They were not considered separate. And then the scientific revolution happened. So we talked about this already. So the scientific revolution has a radically different understanding of matter. So matter is real for the scientific revolution, just by itself. Aristotle, matter is just a potential to be something. After the scientific revolution, matter is already real all by itself. It's an independent substance. There's independent rules governing it. And the forms and purposes and all that metaphysical mumbo-jumbo from Aristotle gets booted out of the universe, right? That doesn't get to be in the universe anymore. It's just matter being matter. Now, however, I take it that we all have some sense of having minds, of being perceivers, of being conscious, of making meaning and understanding true sentences and doing reasoning and all that stuff. So there seems to be this lingering question of what the mind is. We've got this scientific picture of matter being just matter, and it's really only got one property. So for the really strong materialist mechanistic tradition, matter has exactly one property: extension. It just takes up space. That's all it does. It just takes up space. And excludes other matter. So when you push something, that's one thing taking up space, interacting with another thing taking up space. That's all it does. But now, what's the relationship between mind and matter? That becomes a really urgent and difficult question to answer. And although it might feel like Descartes trying to defend his Christianity by talking about a distinction between mind and matter, I think it's actually plausible to say that what he's really doing is just working out the consequences of the scientific revolution. He's really just taking seriously what people are telling him about the material world, the best science available, and then refusing to relinquish the first person perspective from which everybody starts, right? Like everybody, your only access to the material world is through your conscious experience, right? We're all agreed on that, yeah. You don't get to just have, there's the world. I have direct access to it, not through my perception. Your perception, your first person perspective, is your only access to the world. So Descartes just says, look, I'm gonna take that very, very seriously and try to work out the consequences of this picture of how matter works that's given to me by science. And what he ends up with is what we've already discussed, a kind of dualism. So dualism is the view that mind and matter are independent substances, two fundamentally different kinds of stuff. So dualism is basically going to be the topic for the rest of the day. And the business of today is going to be to look at two good arguments from Descartes and then one bad argument that's just kind of floating around in the culture, and then a couple of other attempts to deal with the problem of dualism. That's our business today. Okay, so you all good? Questions? All right, so let's dig into the first argument. So here's the first argument for Cartesian dualism. This is kind of reconstructed from various parts of Descartes in an attempt to present it clearly. But so here's the argument basically. Look, science, you told me that this is what bodies are like. They have locations in space. But where is mind? Where are your minds? Where is a thought? Can anybody tell me, if I have the thought the sky is blue, where is that? How much does it weigh? Go on, how much does the thought the sky is blue weigh? That seems like it seems like you're making a category error, right? You're just not making sense right now. You're saying things, it sounds like you're saying things, but you're not really saying things. Like it sounds like a question. It's like saying, what's the color of up? Right? That's not a good question. It's just a bad question. You told me, scientific revolution, that the world, in terms of the matter, is meaningless, purposeless, right? That's the whole kicking Aristotle out thing. But you know what I have in my mind? Meaning and purposes. In my mind, there is intentionality. Let me just briefly do intentionality, because I'm not sure I did this properly. So intentionality is the aboutness that your thoughts have. So if I have the thought macaque, it's about this sort of fella. This photo, by the way, was the subject of a lawsuit, totally unrelated. The macaque pressed the button, and made the camera snap. And then the photographer published it and copyrighted it. But then PETA sued him because the macaque, they argued that the macaque owned copyright on the selfie. Anyway. Okay, so the aboutness relation. I have the thought macaque, or the macaque took a selfie. That's about something in the world, right? There's a kind of relationship, a reaching out in some sense of my thought to the world. It's pointing at the macaque in some abstract metaphorical sense. But how is that matter doesn't, you could build a physical arrow, but that's not what we're talking about, right? That's not the type of pointing that we mean. My thought doesn't physically, literally point. It's just about the macaques, right? So intentionality is this property of aboutness. And like, how are you going to get that out of just pure matter? So there's no intentionality in pure matter. Thoughts have lots of intention. Lots of your thoughts are about things. Bodies, they told us, the mechanistic philosophy told us bodies are just extension. They just take up space. Again, how much space does a thought take up? That doesn't even make sense, does it? And bodies, it seems, pure material can't be a subject. Whereas a mind has to be a subject. That's part of what it is to be a mind, is to have subjectivity, to have a point of view. Okay, so Descartes says, hey, all of the most important properties of bodies are not shared by the most important properties of minds. All of the most important properties of minds are not shared by bodies. Therefore, they're two separate things. Yeah? So the scientific revolution tells us minds and matter share none of their properties. Therefore, they're not the same things. Yeah?
What would like imagination kind of productivity class number there?
Oh. Yeah, well, you don't, I mean, can you imagine pure matter having imagination? Not really, but you imagined it. So
when you just said like matter has no mind, is there a certain term for that, or is it defined by any of these?
Well, so imagination is a kind of intentionality where you're representing a situation that doesn't exist. You're representing a possibility. So you're thinking about the so if I'm like, I would really like spaghetti for dinner, I'm representing in my mind the situation where tonight I eat spaghetti. And that seems to be a kind of aboutness. It's an especially weird kind of aboutness because it's about something that doesn't exist yet, and probably won't have something. I probably won't have spaghetti, so I probably never will have spaghetti for dinner. So it's about just a mere possibility. That's super weird to imagine just matter doing that, right? That seems like a thing only minds could do. But it's clearly a thing like none of you are like, oh no, you can't imagine spaghetti for dinner. Of course we can. Of course we can. So hard to understand how matter could do it. Easy to recognize that minds can do it. So yeah.
I just had a question about like how bodies can be a subject. I don't really understand.
So, yeah. Well, it's if cognitive science is going to be a thing, it has to eventually turn out that just pure matter can be a subject. So the whole game is to figure out how it is possible that pure matter can in fact turn out to have a subjective point of view. But if matter is just a bunch of stuff that just excludes other stuff, it's just shapes spinning around in the void, it's very hard to see how it could have a perspective. Yeah, that's debatable though, right?
I think that's like
Yeah? All right.
like even just saying that like, well, you don't have to necessarily say that like matter has a mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something you have to attribute to matter. But to say that matter can affect other matter, then that means to the other piece of matter, then the matter that's about to affect it is thus a subject.
Okay, so you're...
It's going to affect it eventually, and so...
So I think you're taking this in the subject-object sense? So if the fire burns down the tree, then the fire is the tree is the subject and the fire is the object, or something? It's got to be one or the other. Good, thank you. Yeah, so we don't mean this in the linguistic sense. We mean this in the sense of having a subjective perspective, having a point of view, or having a conscious awareness of. That's the sense. Even that's got to be debatable, though, right? So I take it that if you have a camera and you take a picture, the camera in some sense has a point of view, right? It's got literally a point from which it views the world. So debatable. All of this has got to be debate. All of this has got to be, again, if I'm assuming that we're mostly materialists, most people these days are materialists. If you're trying to do cognitive science, you have to believe that this is going to be wrong somehow. Like this is all going to fail. If this is right, cognition is done. You can't study minds scientifically if they're not material, because you can only study material things. So it's got to be wrong somehow. Yeah.
I find it hard to understand how we jump from them not sharing important properties to being separate.
Good. Okay. So that's a leap. Okay. So let's see. So, all right. Doesn't the following general rule seem okay to you? So this is the question. So does the following general rule of inference seem correct to you? Two things that don't have any properties in common are different things. Doesn't it? And then the question is that an appropriate rule for making this inference? So, like, yeah. Does it? I don't know.
I mean, if you take the analogy of the mind being like software,
Yep.
well, software is like radically different from hardware, but it's still like.
Good. So in the end, software is instantiated in hardware. Okay, that might work actually. So we'll see some softened versions of dualism by the end of this class. We'll dial this back a bit before the end of the class. But so like, yeah. Do you have a comment on this specifically? Okay, yeah.
So like anything that we can implement in hardware, usually we can implement in software. Anything in software you can usually implement on hardware. Like a Turing machine can simulate a Turing machine, or a neural network can simulate a Turing machine. So if this is the case that mind and matter share no different properties, a mind somehow simulate matter, I guess, on it, and matter can somehow simulate a mind.
So the claim has to be somehow that, so if the argument is, look, here's a list of properties of one thing, here's a list of properties of the other, and notice that it's not just a random collection of properties. So maybe it can help strengthen this a bit. Notice it's not just a random collection of properties. Each of these is a mutually exclusive thing. Like this one has weight. This one doesn't have weight. It's not just like one is blue and one is valuable. It's they're like the negation of each other. When it's like it's this thing and this thing is not that thing. So having that negated set of properties seems like it's a reasonably strong one. But maybe that's not enough to say that they're fundamentally different kinds of things. I actually think this is ultimately not a valid argument. It's ultimately not a valid argument. But yeah.
I was going to say, don't they share like common rules? Like both share causality?
Yeah. So very good. So this is basically like, this is the sense in which I think this is going to end up not being a valid argument. So you could do something like the following move, and I don't remember if I have a slide. I was looking to see if I have a slide. No, I don't. Okay, good. So here's a list of properties, but there's no argument giving that these are all and only the relevant properties. So maybe the next 30 properties we discover are shared between the two. And then you could say something like, well, your Ford Taurus and my Nissan Altima, one is blue and one is not blue, one is a Ford and one is not a Ford, One is a 4-cylinder, one is a 6-cylinder, but that doesn't mean they're not both cars. They're both cars. So you could generate a list like this where we're like, no, they're just fundamentally opposed kinds of beings. There's no relation whatsoever between Ford Tauruses and Nissan Altimas. And the assumption is that you've listed all of the relevant properties. And that's why this is not a logically valid argument in the sense that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows deductively. What I would propose it is, yeah, we got this stuff, is a inference to the best explanation. Yeah, so sorry, we're jumping around, but I think it's better to follow the conversation than my PowerPoint slides. So inference to the best explanation says something like this. Theory T is the best explanation of our observations X. We happen to see observation X, therefore theory T is probably true. So Descartes doing something like an inference to the best explanation. He's saying, look, we've got this picture that comes out of the scientific worldview. That picture tells us that here's what bodies are like, and I can tell you here's what minds are like. They're very, very different. Let me give you a theory that would potentially explain why that difference exists, and then therefore probably that theory is true. Does anybody who knows their logical fallacies notice the similarity between this and a famous logical fallacy? This is what we call affirming the consequent. So if I say, let me give you an argument that's of the same basic form as this. If I was robbed, then I wouldn't have very much money. I don't have very much money, therefore I was probably robbed. Now, what haven't you done there? You haven't accounted for the fact that maybe I don't make that much money. Maybe I spent it all. Maybe I got a big fancy TV and I didn't budget for it. Those are alternate theories about why I might not have very much money. Maybe I was just finished being a grad student for 8 years, and that's the explanation. That would also be a sufficient explanation, right? So this is technically it's an invalid argument in the logical sense, unless you can exclude other theories. So basically, to make this argument work, what you have to say is not only is this a good theory to explain our observations, it's the only theory. And then you get a logically valid explanation. There's no other theory that can do the job. So no, I checked my bank account, I should have money, I didn't spend profligately, I was employed in a meaningful way, not as a grad student, that kind of thing. So if you can rule out all of the other theories, then this argument works. So basically what we have to do is figure out whether Descartes has ruled out all of the other ways of explaining this apparent difference. So it's a fairly compelling, I think on its face, it's a pretty compelling case that like, look, there's really big differences between mind and matter. They act real different. They look real different. But to conclude that they are fundamentally different substances, you need to have looked at all the alternative possible explanations and ruled them all out. So the conclusion that Descartes comes to from this and another argument that we'll look at in a little bit is Cartesian dualism, that mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things. They're fundamentally different substances. So your mind is made of mind stuff, and your body's made of physical stuff like the rest of the universe. And most people don't think this in an explicit fashion. Most people are like, nah, there's just matter, right? Religious traditions preserve some of this. So if you're in the Christian tradition, for example, or the Muslim tradition, you're like, yeah, no, there's a soul, right? So one of the things you can do is identify mind stuff with souls and say, yeah, your soul outlives your body. After the dissolution of your body, your soul will continue on. If you're not in the religious tradition, most people don't explicitly hold any kind of dualism. But careful with this because it's not explicit, but it is often implicit. So notice, for example, how these Cartesian assumptions about this fundamental separation between mind and body were built into the good old-fashioned AI tradition. The idea was that you didn't need to do any representing of the physical side of things in order to capture what's most important about the mind. You didn't need to include timing. You didn't need to include biology or the biological limits. None of that was relevant to them. And this is in some sense a profound belief or assumption, implicit assumption of the basic Cartesian framework. I'm telling you, this Cartesian framework is deep, deep in our culture, our being modern Western culture. Notice how much of our language is still structured around the assumption of a deep separation between mind and body. You say, I want to get up, but my body won't let me. People say things like this all the time, right? All the time. But think about that sentence. Think about the sentence. I want to get up, but my body won't let me. My body's not agreeing with me. Who is I in that sentence? Who are you except your body? If you're a materialist, that means you believe that you are your body. So you can't be disagreeing, right? You're implicitly believing that what you are, so the structure of that sentence implicitly assumes that what you are is a little ghostly thing who's watching your body from afar. You are watching your body operate, not being fundamentally, intrinsically intertwined with it. The Cartesian assumption is everywhere in our way of speaking and thinking about ourselves, that we make a distinction between I, me, and my body. Like my body is a separate object from myself. But you can't possibly really believe that if you're a physicalist, right? If you believe that there's no ghost stuff, like you either believe in a soul or you believe that there's no distinction really between you and your body, right? Right? So this way of speaking and thinking about ourselves basically comes out of the Cartesian tradition, where there's this just deep schism between me and my body. Like my body is an object for me rather than the me in some profound way. Lots and lots of philosophers have tried to unravel this, have tried to kind of get over the Cartesian tradition. We've been sort of doing self-therapy on trying to get out from under the Cartesian assumptions, but it's deep in our kind of like cultural memory. But we didn't need that we didn't need Heidegger to sort of get us out of Cartesianism in the sense that finding problems with it. So like right away, people noticed some issues with this whole dualism thing. Right away. For example, if minds or bodies are fundamentally different kinds of stuff, how do they interact? Like your mind has no weight, it has no place, it has no physical ability to cause things. Because the only thing that can physically cause things are other physical things. So how is it that stuff happening to your body gets transmitted to your mind? How is it things that happen in your mind get transmitted to your body? This is just by making them two fundamentally different kinds of stuff, that problem becomes impossible to answer. I think I mentioned Descartes' attempt to answer it, which is, he said, animal spirits, which is a very subtle form of matter. It's inside your nerves. Descartes was a good scientist, by the way, and he learned, for example, that nerves have an important part of like relaying things from the brain to the body. But he thought the nerves contained a very light, diffuse substance, so that the mind could influence it. But the weight isn't really the crucial issue, is it? Right? Just making it light and airy doesn't solve the interaction problem, right? It just makes it sound like it's easier, but it doesn't. It could be 1,000,000 pounds or it could be like a millionth of a gram. It doesn't make it any easier for something that's not material to have material influences. Here's another kind of deep problem for the Cartesian picture. If the interaction between minds and matters is a problem, then here's another problem that kind of follows on its heels. You don't have any evidence that anybody else has a mind. So you have evidence, according to Descartes, you have evidence that you have a mind because you have this kind of first personal direct access to the fact that you've got a mind. But if it's the case that minds and bodies can't interact, then all I ever see of anybody else is their body, right? And the effects of their body. So that's causally cut off. The bodies are causally cut off from minds. That means that I have precisely zero evidence that anybody but me has a mind. Like you don't see people's minds, do you? In a literal sense? Well, you do. If minds and bodies are one and the same, then you do, in a literal sense, see people's minds. Because if the mind is something that your whole body does, so if, for example, I think with my hands, literally think with my hands, and this seems to be the case, if you make people sit on their hands and tell them to give you directions to somewhere, they're much less able to do it. So if you're literally thinking with your hands, then you are literally seeing my mind by observing my body. But that's assuming a deep interconnection between minds and bodies that Descartes has denied. If they are profoundly different things, then you don't have any evidence that anybody else has a mind, which is scary and creepy. I find Descartes' philosophy, and this, I'm just going to tell you my kind of personal spontaneous reaction, profoundly isolating. Because all you get, you as a mind are just this hovering ghost that gets sense data from a body that you're barely connected to, and you're just profoundly separated from everybody else in the universe. I find it very lonely, chillingly lonely. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just my personal, spontaneous emotional reaction. Anyway, so if they call this the interaction problem, the problem of how minds and bodies interact. If that's a problem, it generates this problem of other minds. And people almost immediately notice this about Descartes' thing. Almost immediately. And you might ask yourself, like, Descartes, you couldn't come up with anything better than animal spirits? Because people also immediately noticed that that wasn't a good answer. Like, it didn't take us centuries to untangle this knot. It was like, hey, Descartes, that's a bad answer. But I would like to propose to you that given what he's working with, this is the best that he could have done. Because he's really just sort of taking seriously the best science at the time and also his personal first-person perspective. And I would recommend that we should all be doing both of those things. Don't give up on science. Don't give up on your first-person perspective on the world either. And he's just doing his very best to hold those both at the same time. And it led him to this impossible situation where he has to posit substance dualism, as far as he could tell, and couldn't defend it metaphysically because it ends up in absolutely untenable consequences. So, yeah. So we don't have to worry about this. I think we basically did this. So these are kind of critiques for this argument. Like maybe a better argument that Descartes could have made so that we noticed that it was invalid. He could have said that we have the essential properties of the mind. So recall this list. Sorry, I'm jumping around a lot, but recall this list. And we said the problem with this is, yeah, there could be 50 other properties here, and maybe they're all shared between minds and bodies. And therefore, Descartes, you didn't give us a compelling reason to think that they're different things. Descartes could have the following reply. He could say, well, no, what I picked out for you are the essential properties, the essences of minds and bodies. The essence of a mind is that it identifies meaning and it deals with intentionality and all that stuff. The essence of a body is that it has extension and it doesn't have meaning and all that stuff. So that would be a valid argument, actually. So if that's true, if those premises are true, then they actually would lead to the conclusion. Because if you've identified the essential properties of one thing and the essential properties of another, and they're opposite properties, then you can tell that they're not the same kind of thing. That works. Now, we did see some problems with the idea of essences. When we did categorization, we found that most things in the world don't have essences. But some things might. I mean, there's some things that actually do have necessary and sufficient conditions. Like you can tell me those are pictures, it's a picture of some diamonds. You can tell me what the necessary and sufficient conditions to be a diamond are, right? It's being a bunch of carbon atoms arranged in the right structure. If it's got that, it's a diamond. If it doesn't, it's not. So like that's pretty good. And if something's a diamond, you can give me a bunch of other properties. You can infer from category membership a bunch of other properties. You can tell me something about its hardness, about its refraction index, the fact that big multinational corporations will try to extort money out of you for them. Like those are the kind of solid inferences that you can make from category membership. So that will be good. You know, those were the essences of minds and bodies. But notice what we don't have at the moment. We don't have laws of the mind. We don't have scientific laws about the mind. We don't have a complete, that's what a completed cognitive science or completed psychology would be, mental laws. We don't seem to have that. We certainly didn't have it in Descartes' day. So it's hard to say what the essence of a mind is. That would be to have the criterion of the cognitive, wouldn't it? So absent that, it's hard to make this version of the argument. Okay. And we did that. All right, so enough of this thing. Enough of this argument. Let's do Descartes' other argument, shall we? Okay, so here's a separate argument. Call it the comparative realness argument, Descartes' comparative realness argument. And it's about our access to the world. How do you know things about the world? So in his view, the mind doesn't directly touch the world. So remember all the stuff about how primary, secondary qualities, right? So like you learn, for Aristotle, when I see the chair, I have a conformity with it. Like I'm literally, the essence of the chair is in the chair, and it's also in my mind. I'm really directly connected to the world. And part of Descartes and the scientific revolution in general was to reject that and say, no, you learn about the world through mathematics. Remember that? So we were like, don't believe, you know, it looks like the sun's going around the earth. Don't believe that. I've got some really good math that shows you that that's not true. Right? So it's not that you just look at I look at the window and I see it looks like the sun's moving around us. That would be a direct access. Forget that. What we're going to do is make this complicated inference from the movement of lights in the night sky to the structure of the solar system, and that's going to tell you about the real structure of reality. So it's not a direct access anymore. However, a crucial part of Descartes' epistemology, his theory of knowledge, is that we do have direct access to our own minds. You don't have direct access to the world, but for example, is everybody here conscious? Good. How do you know that you're conscious? What did you investigate? Your awakeness. How do you know you're awake? How do you know that you're proper? Okay, so I take it that what you didn't actually have to, I bet that you didn't actually have to go through this inferential process to know that you are at least, so doing the dreams versus reality thing, you do have to do some inferences like, okay, I have a relatively coherent picture and all this stuff, but just to have the I am having experiences right now, you just know. You don't have to do anything else to know that you're aware. You just directly have access to that, don't you? It's just there for you. I do think that we can sometimes exaggerate the degree to which we know our own minds directly. I have often been surprised by myself, things that my mind has done. People have regularly been like, why are you so mad? I'm not mad. And then you check your pulse and think about it a bit and like, oh, wait, okay, no, I was mad. So we might exaggerate the degree to which we have full access to what's going on in our minds, but nonetheless, we seem to have a very direct connection to the at least the conscious content of our experience. So the mind is more real to us than the body. And if X is more or less real than Y, then X and Y are not identical. So a difference in reality entails a difference in the kind of thing that it is. And this is Descartes' argument, his comparative realness argument. Yeah?
I kind of be able to understand the difference in reality. Like, if I'm hallucinating or dreaming, and I can't tell whether or not I am hallucinating or dreaming,
Uh-huh.
how would I do
Oh, so Descartes' argument precisely starts from the premise that you can't. But that's about whether I'm hallucinating or dreaming is a question about whether I'm accurately connected to reality, external reality. So this is in the Meditations. This is precisely his path through this stuff. He's like, well, how can I tell I'm not dreaming right now? How can you tell? How do you actually tell that you're not dreaming? Well, feels different. Feels different. But not in the dream, does it? In the dream, it's like, yeah, everything's normal.
I'm a lucid dreamer.
Oh, okay. So if you're a lucid dreamer, in the relatively small percentage of the population who lucidly dreams, you can tell the difference. But for most of us, most of the time, the dream seems fully convincing. And this is Descartes' so how do I know I'm not dreaming? How do I know I'm not being tricked? How do I know I'm not in the matrix? And that's his argument that you don't directly touch the world. And if you're not in direct contact with the world, all you're sure of, he says, is that I am having an experience. Because you have direct access to that. Sorry, yeah.
I just had a quick question. So let's say we're talking about pain.
Yeah.
You're experiencing pain.
Yeah.
Like I can understand how it's not your mind experiencing pain, nor is it your mind direct. Well, your mind is directly connected with itself because it's understanding that it's hurting.
Mm-hmm.
But can you really say that the mind is more real in terms of the pain you're feeling in your body? I mean, if you have a burn, like on your finger or something,
Yeah.
to your body, it's a burn. But it's the same thing with your mind.
So,
I don't know if that's a tangent, but I was just
well, okay, so it's a question about like, doesn't that make the body directly accessible to you? Is that the kind of thought?
I'm just confused about how, like, so does the point where it says the mind is more real than the body also applicable to that?
Well, yes. So it's the idea that, I mean, so realness is sort of cash out. There's a kind of slip here from how certain am I to how real it is, the degree of reality of it. So he's saying, look, I'm very, very certain about the contents of my mind. I'm not certain about the contents of what's going on with my body. I can be tricked about that. And therefore, they're different things. Yeah, sorry, yeah. Well, it's really, hallucination is really not a problem for him. It's his primary argument.
I mean, like, delusional people, or people who just...
No, he includes in the Meditations an argument it's called the evil demon argument. So he says, how do I know that I'm not being tricked by an evil demon? How do I know that there's not something that's consistently making me think things are real which are not real? And he uses that argument to say, that's part of this argument. He's saying, look, I don't have any certainty about anything except my subjective states. All I can know is that I am, this is I think therefore I am. It's not an inference. What he's saying is, if I'm being tricked, then at least I know that I'm having an experience. Being tricked is an experience, having a hallucination is an experience. You can't tell whether the experience relates to the outside world. All you can tell for sure is that you're having an experience. That's the part he thinks you cannot doubt. Yeah.
What about, say, laws of matter
Yep.
or mathematics?
Yep.
Those are things that exist in the world, right?
I agree.
Don't we have direct contact with those things?
So, it might be the case that what you're pointing out is a kind of instability in his argument. So, yeah, that's good. So, in some sense, Descartes has given us two very different standards of reality, which might be what you're picking up on right now. So, in some moods, what he tells us, here's what's really real. It's your subjective experience. And then, but didn't he just tell us that what's really real is what math tells us about the universe? That's what you should believe in, right? So it looks like, here's the basic problem with this argument. It looks like Descartes' given us two completely different and incompatible standards for what's real. Does that kind of catch what you're on about? A little bit?
I think so.
Yeah, like, I mean, so in some sense, I don't think you have direct access to the laws of nature, at least the mathematical formulations of them. Otherwise, physics would be a lot easier. You should be like, relativity theory, here it is.
It's like rules of the universe don't have like all those properties Descartes listed.
Right.
They're kind of mental properties. Don't you think so?
The rules of the universe, so that,
Like the rules themselves.
right. So there's no, where is F equals MA? Like, where is that? Yeah, and I mean, like, that's exactly like where is a thought. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah.
You said we weren't doing comps.
Yeah, we can't do comps. Yeah. Very good. Yeah.
You could be tricked into thinking math is real.
You thinking the what?
Math is real.
That's right. So this is okay. So this is part of when Descartes in his "my mind is the only real thing" mood. This is one of the things he considers. So like, do I know for sure that 2 + 2 = 4? I don't know. Maybe I'm being tricked. Maybe there's an evil demon tricking with a lot of time on its hands, apparently, who's tricking me into thinking that 2 + 2 = 4. I can doubt that. I'm able to doubt that, but I'm unable to doubt that I'm having sensations that I'm thinking. I'm unable to think the thought that I'm not thinking right now. This is it's an interesting. I mean, it's a classic argument. This is supposed to be again an argument for mind-body dualism. Philosophers have taken this to be so self-evident that when people actually show us that it's false, they can't believe it. So Thomas Metzinger reports going to a philosophy conference and telling people about what's called Anton syndrome. Anton syndrome is, it has a few different forms, but it's when people become convinced that they don't exist. You can have this disorder where you are convinced that you are either dead or completely non-existent. And Descartes says that you can't believe that, right? He says, the one thing that I cannot doubt is that I exist. Impossible to doubt it. And no, actually, people do sometimes have this rather disturbing experience of believing that they don't exist. And when Thomas Metzinger took this to a philosophy conference, they said, no, that can't be right. They can't have believed that because Descartes was so obviously correct about this. So don't, I mean, yeah.
Doesn't believing that you don't exist entail thinking to kind of support it?
What?
They're experiencing, not experiencing, I guess.
In some sense, yes. In some sense, yes. But they did exist. We can tell that by the fact that they existed. So they were wrong about that. They were being irrational, but they were perfectly capable of having the thought, I don't exist, and believing it sincerely, as far as anybody can tell. That's the point. Anyway, okay, enough beating up Descartes. So what this leaves us with is what's called generally the mind-body problem. Here we go. This is my example of Cartesianism in kind of contemporary ways of thinking. I think I've had this experience and framed it to myself in Cartesian terms, where I'm like telling my body as though it was some separate entity from me, get up, get off the couch. And the body's like, no. This problem basically persists because the ways we think about minds, the way we think about bodies have sort of drifted apart, and it's hard to connect them. We talked about Descartes' solution. Let me just do one bad argument for dualism, just because it comes up. People do make this argument, mostly in casual conversations. I don't have a citation for you, but like, here's a thing that sometimes people say, and it's just a terrible, terrible argument. Look, I'm aware of my mind, but I have no subjective awareness of my brain. Therefore, my mind is not my brain. Okay, and here is an exactly analogous argument. Lois Lane is aware of Clark Kent. She is not aware of Superman. Therefore, Clark Kent is not Superman. Okay. Obviously a bad argument. I don't know why people make this argument. Nonetheless, sometimes they do. Anyway. All right. So, the mind-body problem is experienced by people almost immediately as a deep problem, as a serious problem, and as a problem that needs some way of responding. We need some way of responding to this thing. And we can't do Descartes' thing, most people agreed, because Descartes' thing doesn't work. It leaves you with this interaction problem. How do minds and bodies connect? How do they work together? It seems really obvious to people that their minds and their bodies are somehow coordinated. Nonetheless, his arguments for dualism seem pretty compelling. So what do we do? How do we deal with this? Here's a couple of shots at this. So Malebranche provides what he calls occasionalism. So occasionalism is a kind of broad view about causation, and we actually saw it once already in Al-Ghazali. But here's the basic version of it for the mind-body problem. Every time there's a mental event, God notices and steps in and generates the corresponding physical event. And every time there's a physical event that would cause a mental event, God notices and steps in and causes the relevant mental event. Huh? So like, how do minds and bodies coordinate? God's just doing the handiwork. He's just stepping in and just making sure everything works together. God's a busy guy. Okay. So, what do you think of occasionalism? Yeah.
Well, I think recently someone said God is dead, so.
Yes, I believe some dead guy said that. Yeah. Yeah. So the crucial. I mean, for most modern people who are in this field, at least, the crucial problem here is that you're invoking God to explain something, and the whole point of an argument. Here's how all arguments work. You come up with a premise that's less controversial than the conclusion. It has to be something you cannot build an argument from premises that are more controversial than the thing that you're trying to establish. Arguments, despite their reputation and despite how they operate on the internet, are actually ways of coming to agree with the other people. And they are collaborative processes of trying to find things that everybody agrees with and move to use them as leverage to find further knowledge and information. That's what an argument does, and it cannot operate. Arguments simply cannot work from citing the most controversial thesis like God not only exists, but is a busybody making sure that everything gets coordinated. This doesn't even agree with most people's interpretation of God. So most religious people's interpretation of God has God much less involved in day-to-day affairs than this. So it's a pretty specific picture of God that you need to have to make this work, which not even all religious people and all non-religious people are going to reject. So that's basically the problem with this. I mean, if you're willing to buy the God's involved part, this is actually a solution, though. Like, it's actually a solution. It's just you need the God bit. Generally speaking, it's not going to be a good move to invoke God in your arguments, in your non-theological arguments. Here's another one from Leibniz. So yeah, this is remember the calculus guy, you know, Leibniz did a lot of stuff. He established a similar but different one, which is pre-established harmony. So imagine you got two clocks sitting beside each other, and one is just like 1 second ahead of the other one. So every time this clock ticks, the other one ticks a second later. Tick, 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 tick. It's going to look to you like one of them is causing the other to tick. Every time clock A ticks, clock B ticks a second later. So here's Leibniz's solution. It's just like that. You got a mental world. It's physically it's a kind of dualism. There's the mental universe, and there's the physical universe. And they have just been carefully arranged such that it seems like mental events are causing physical events, and physical events are causing mental events. There's a pre-established harmony between the two realms, and but there's no actual causation going between them. Mental things are not causing physical things are not causing mental things. They're just nicely tuned up to look like they are. Tuned up by whom is a fair question in this context. And his answer is going to be God. I mean, it's got to be God, right? It's got to be God. Yeah.
So I kind of read this a while ago, and in that it was kind of a thought experiment in which there's a person who's lying down, and then they think of getting up, but then their mental property gets up, and then the physical property is still down there, like on the bed. But like, if we think about this, then that doesn't really apply.
So
I don't know. Yeah.
I think I've got a picture of this actually. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Oh, no. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So her mental aspect has gotten up and her physical aspect is just lagging behind a little. Okay, so sorry, can you?
Yeah, like, how does that connect with likeness on?
Well, so he's got a,
Dualism, right, in a sense.
it's possible?
It's also dualism in a sense, right?
It is. I take it that what he's trying to do is to explain the fact that we don't really see that very much, do we? Like, it's not the case that that happens a lot. Is it?
You can still think of it, right?
We can imagine it. We can absolutely imagine it. But I take it that the apparent coordination between, that's exactly what he's saying. We can imagine the case where the mind and the body don't line up. But as a matter of fact, they seem to on the regular, right? Like, it's a very regular fact that if I stub my toe, I have the mental experience of pain. So what he's trying to do is explain that apparently regular connection between minds and bodies. Now, if it happened to be the case so it would actually be really good for dualism if, that was just sort of a sloppy, irregular connection. So if sometimes your spirits stood up while your body just laid there, just like one out of 100 times that happened, that would actually be really good for dualism in the sense that would show that they're not always connected. Maybe God forgot that one. So actually, yeah, for not just dualism, but for either Leibniz's pre-established harmony or for occasionalism, it would say like, yeah, mostly these things go together, but once in a while they get out of sync. That would actually be really good for these guys because we wouldn't have the very difficult problem of explaining why they are always lined up. I mean, we still have to explain their mostly connections, but I think that would be okay for these guys. Yeah. Yeah.
Then with that, like, isn't this whole thing supporting when people have like dissociation? Like,
So.
and that's a huge thing. Like, people are now diagnosed with dissociation because they dissociate constantly from who they are. Like,
Right. So a non-correlation between their mental and physical experiences. Yeah. So that's a kind of version of this in that sense. Yeah. I take it that if you're not already in the metaphysics of this, we don't have to go there. You don't have to use this to explain dissociation unless you're already kind of in this metaphysics, right? But it would fit with this nicely. So again, this thought experiment and the fact of dissociation for Leibniz, for Malebranche, they could say something like, yeah, well, sometimes God doesn't do it. And that's, so the whole thing of occasionalism was, remember with Al-Ghazali, he's arguing for occasionalism because the necessary connections between things seemed like an affront to the power of God. It seemed like, well, why couldn't God make it that the rock flies up? Like, it's God, he can do anything he wants. So in occasionalism, they say it's a voluntary act by God. Every time there's a causal connection between two things, God is acting voluntarily of his own free will because he decided to. He's just a guy with regular habits, just a fellow that likes things to do the same thing over and over again, at least for the last couple billion years, kind of thing. So it could totally be the case that God one time decides, I think the rock's gonna fly up this time, or like you're gonna sit up and your spirit's gonna sit up and your body's gonna lay down, or like you're gonna have physical sensations that aren't gonna make it to your mind. So God could totally do that because God can do whatever he wants, which is why it's bad to invoke God in your arguments, because it's like, well, you do whatever he wants. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
This, like, I feel like if they just keep counting God in, even though, like, they're using it because in the 1600s, that's kind of what was wanted in the Middle Ages, like, isn't that kind of discounting evolution as a thing?
Well, they didn't know about evolution yet. Yeah. Yeah. That's an 1800s thing. Yeah. So notice how. Hang on one second. Notice how they've kind of got backed into this. I mean, this is, I hope this strikes you as, it strikes me as weird, and it's shoddy philosophy, but that's the main counter argument. It's like, oh, it's weird and gross, I don't like it. But they're kind of been backed into this corner because Descartes' argument for the difference between minds and bodies struck people as very compelling. Because it comes straight, it's not just something he made up, it's just a diagnosis of what happened in the scientific revolution, which everybody in the kind of intellectual world in Europe at the time is neck deep in. So he's like, hey guys, look at all this stuff we're doing in science right now. That entails dualism. And people are like, yeah, okay, sure. And then how do we get minds and bodies interacting? And Descartes says, animal spirits. And everybody's like, really? Because that doesn't sound good to me. And then that leaves this gap of trying to explain the connection between the two. So there's this mind-body problem that arises, and you got to do something. You got limited resources to deal with this. So like it's a deep, deep problem. Once you accept that minds and bodies are fundamentally different kinds of things, getting them back together is urgent and very, very difficult. So coming up with things like pre-established harmony, it seems desperate, honestly. Like it seems like a really desperate move, but there's very few other options available to you. So they kind of got back to, like it sounds, if you just say it, it sounds silly, which is why I wanted to go through all of the history here to show you how we got to the point where this guy invented he's not dumb, he invented calculus. Like he's a clever fella. And why is he saying this? It's because the logic that got them there made perfect sense, and then they ended up being like, I don't know, maybe God did it. Yeah.
So like, in Leibniz's view is, like, why does God require it, first of all? Like, if you look at like our universe, there's different universal constants of like gravity and magnetism.
Yep.
Like in his viewpoint, there's kind of a generator universe with dots, and then kind of an implementer universe of physical realities. Is that?
Well, they're both substances on a par. They're just two fundamentally different kinds of substances, and they both interact with each other. Mental things cause physical things cause mental things.
But the physical things happen like almost like a second after the mental things happen, is what he's saying? Like the synchrony?
Sorry, the clock metaphor is a one-way metaphor, and he knows that doesn't quite work. But imagine like, it's not. It's that the metaphor doesn't quite work. Because sometimes the physical happens before the mental, sometimes the mental happens before the physical. But it's just supposed to be just a primer on. You can just imagine two processes unfolding in parallel that look like they're causally interacting, but it's just been cleverly set up that way.
So does he also then believe that like some things don't require the other process that happens, like just the physical object just sitting there? Like,
Oh, of course, yeah. So you don't need mind to generate non-mental phenomenon. So when the rock falls, that's not because mind caused it. It's just, that's the way it is. Yeah. I appreciate you all coming on this very weird philosophy journey with me. I know that I believe the two philosophers in this class are not here at present. So all of you are non-philosophers willing to engage in this very bizarre activity of doing philosophy. So thank you very much for like coming along for the ride. None of you have stormed out in disgust yet, so that's nice. So we've been doing substance dualism. Let me now tell you about a couple of other types of dualism that maybe get some of the advantages of substance dualism without the weird interaction problem that we got from Descartes, without having to invoke God either constantly micromanaging the universe or very elaborately setting it up beforehand. So substance dualism, that's when there's two fundamentally different types of things. Let's talk a little bit about property dualism now. So property dualism is the idea that mind and matter are two different kinds of properties of things. And that contrasts with the only other one is that predicate dualism. So it's two different types of properties that things can have. Predicate dualism is that mind and body are just two different ways of talking about things. It's the weakest form of dualism. I don't think it gets the advantages of dualism, other dualisms, so we'll kind of leave it to the side. But property dualism is the one we should consider. So consider the idea that maybe there are emergent properties in the following sense. So sodium, if you take a chunk of sodium and throw it in water, it explodes. Pure metallic sodium is very fun. I recommend it. Do it at home. Bring your kids. Sodium will just explode. Chlorine is a poisonous gas. It will kill you. So we've got an exploding thing and a poisonous gas, and you put them together, and is it both exploding and poisonous, or does it make food taste good? Sodium chloride. It's that and fat are the basic elements of deliciousness. So what happened to the deadly explodingness of it all? Well, maybe the whole is got different properties than its parts in some important sense. Oxygen is a gas at room temperature. Hydrogen is a gas at room temperature. You get them together and they are a liquid at room temperature. It's not a simple combination of the properties of those parts. There's something that emerges in some sense from the combination. So the whole has different properties than the parts have. This is the thought of property dualism, and they mean different in a really deep sense. So those physical examples, maybe you could spin a story where, oh, actually, okay, so sodium isn't intrinsically explodey, chlorine isn't intrinsically deadly. You could probably tell me a story about how the fundamental properties, like having a certain number of electrons and neutrons and protons, add up to the overall properties of salt. But the argument in property dualism is that there's just a whole new type of property that emerges when you get a mind. So that is to say, a mind is an emergent property of, it's not a different kind of stuff, right? A property dualist says the mind is a fundamentally different kind of stuff. Substance dualist says that. A property dualist says, really there's only one kind of stuff, but it's got two deeply and powerfully different kinds of properties. Mental properties, physical properties. And you can't just reduce one to the other. You can't cash out mental properties in terms of physical properties. You can't take apart the mind and find at its base physical like properties. So there's a kind of discontinuity in the world where you get matter arranged in the right way, and this new type of property emerges in a way that's not explainable in terms of the lower level parts. You can get the deliciousness of salt from its lower level properties, probably in an elaborate explanation, but not minds, is the claim. Yeah?
So is this kind of what dynamical systems theory is trying to talk about, or is this like some sort of like very base precursor to that?
I think that usually dynamical systems theory people don't think of themselves as doing this. They think of themselves as doing a different kind, I would say it's a different kind of emergence, maybe a lesser form of emergence. So dynamical systems theory, I like to distinguish what's called epistemic from ontological emergence. So in epistemic emergence, you can't explain the whole in terms of its parts, or that is to say the explanation of the whole is just different than the explanation of the parts. Whereas in ontological emergence, there's fundamentally new kinds of properties that emerge. Like it's just a different sort of thing. This time not a different sort of substance, but it's a kind of like new categories of being turn up. So I think that the dynamical systems people who talk about emergence in the physical systems, usually they're talking about epistemic emergence. They're not saying like, look, the convection roll is just you can't even begin to imagine how convection rolls connect to water. They're like, no, it's water, fine, it's water. But you can't tell the right kind of story at the level of the parts. Whereas the property dualists, let me show you one of their arguments, and maybe that'll help illustrate the difference. They're making, I would say, a stronger claim. Okay, so let me tell you about a fun little thought experiment. Has anybody heard the Mary in the Room thought experiment? Hands up if you've heard this. Ah, good. I love it. I love it. It bothers me to tell a room full of people stuff they already know. So when you don't know stuff, I'm very excited. Okay, so this is a really famous thought experiment in philosophy called the Mary in the Room thought experiment. And it goes like this. So, and this is supposed to be an argument for property dualism. So this is supposed to convince you that there's just something fundamentally different about mind properties than physical properties. Okay, Mary is a brilliant scientist. She's a brilliant neuroscientist. And she's got access to extremely advanced neuroscience, far beyond what we have access to today. However, she has lived her entire life in a room that is monochromatic. So if you get the right kind of lighting, you can actually just have one color visible, one visible color. So she's got a completely one color world. She's lived her entire life in it, so she's never seen the color red in her entire life. Nonetheless, she's a brilliant scientist who knows everything there is to know about vision. She can tell you from your rods and cones to your visual center, every part of the visual system. She can tell you exactly how it works. She knows everything that there is to know about human vision, including color vision. It's not that she's just learning about black and white vision. She's learned everything there is to know from every neuroscience textbook about how human color perception works. Now, Mary one day steps out of the room and sees the color red for the first time. Here's the question. Did Mary learn anything when she saw red for the first time? Did she learn what it's like to see red? And is that something that wasn't contained in all of these neuroscience textbooks? So by assumption of the thought experiment, she knows all of the physical facts about color perception. Everything there is to know about the physical facts, physiological, biological, neurochemical, she knows all of that stuff. Did she learn anything when she walked out and saw red for the first time? Yeah.
I feel like if you're talking about like neurology, then those pathways in her brain that allows her to identify red had never fired until she walked outside.
Uh-huh.
So something different did happen in her brain.
Okay.
And then I think you'd say that this is something different.
Okay, so that's good. So you very carefully formulated it in a way that both sides could agree with. But the debate is about whether she gained new knowledge. So we both sides of this debate are going to agree that something new has happened. She's had a new experience. But does that constitute new knowledge? And let me tell you what the consequences are if you say yes. That means that there's more to know about the world than the physical facts. The physical facts, if you agree that she learned something new, that means that you cannot explain the whole world with just the physical facts. There are mental facts, like what it's like to experience the color red, that go beyond the physical facts, and therefore there are properties of the world that are not physical. Yeah?
I think she did learn something new, but at the same time, seeing red is not a fact that you can express in the English language.
That's right. What it's like to see red. You can just use, it's like, actually, so somebody once tried to explain what it's like to see red, and they said it was like hearing a trumpet play. Yeah, okay, yeah, but it doesn't really get it, right? Yeah, I agree that that doesn't really capture, you can't, it's unbelievably difficult to express it. So what follows from that?
Since you can't express it in language, she couldn't have possibly known that kind of physical fact because she's only reading from textbooks.
Well, but she's, okay,
So she kind of learned something using her senses, but it's not something you can express from a textbook.
Does that therefore mean that the facts of the world go beyond just the physical facts?
It's not that it goes beyond physical facts, it's just you can't express that physical fact in words.
Yeah. But how could it be that there are physical facts you can't express in words?
Because red is like, it's almost like hallucinating, because you're not sure that you're seeing red, you're just seeing red. Because red could have been green or whatever that evolution determined for you.
Good,
But
good.
it determined that red is red for us.
Yeah.
So red isn't something you express in a language because it's subjective to you, but in the same time, it's something subjective to you and you haven't experienced it, so you're experiencing something new and therefore learning.
So do you agree, I guess the question is, do you agree that this leads us to dualism? No. Okay, okay, okay. Okay, sorry, yeah.
Are colors subjective?
Yes, they are. I mean, so the color experience is subjective.
Not only that, they
But-
tested things with people who are blind, not necessarily who are colorblind, and like it's a series of asking like, have you experienced this emotion? Have you experienced this touch, like the sense? If so, okay, then attribute this and this, like to the color. So,
Okay.
like, for example, with red, have you touched something prickly? Do you know what it's like to feel hurt? Okay, then associate that with color red. Or like people try to, what most often happens is like red is associated with like negativity and anger rather than being associated with like love as like people will grow like, you know, like Valentine's Day. And
Yeah, but-
also like there's a differentiation between like the English language and another language and trying
Sure.
to explain it to like if we're English speaking, trying to explain it to an alien who's never experienced like subjectively what humans have experienced,
Hmm.
like it's completely different. When it comes to like her stepping out of the room, I definitely believe that she learned something. I agree with Lexi, like there's a new neurological pathway that was developed as she like stepped out and saw red, or what she believed to be red.
Uh-huh.
She could have actually seen blue.
Then does that tell us what the people who wrote this thought? So Frank Jackson's using this as an argument for dualism. Does that tell us that the world is not exhausted by the physical facts? What do you think? So what Jackson wants us to think is that yes, and the way he puts it is the following. He says there's something, you can know what it's like to experience something. So what it's like to see red for you, and that's a subjective experience. So it could be different from me or for you. Like maybe what I see as green is what you see as red. It's fair. But there's nonetheless, for each of us, there's something that it's like to experience the color red. And that something that it's likeness is what she learns when she leaves. And that's not a thing that's that's not a thing that's contained in the physical facts, and therefore the physical facts don't tell you everything there is to know about what it's like to be. Yeah,
Is
Constance.
Mary an expert on her own biology?
Everybody's biology. Yeah, she knows everything there is to know about neural pathways. Got a lot of books.
She ripped out her eye and she connected it to a computer, synapse by synapse.
Uh-huh.
She'd be able to simulate red in her monochromatic environment without ever having to go outside. She would be able to.
I mean, if she was that determined, she could have just made some red light. Like,
Yeah, she could have just made some red
But-
light. She could have just typed it directly
Yeah,
into her
yeah,
brain. Like what I'm
yeah.
getting at is like if you were to record that data going through her eyes and being processed in the brain,
Uh-huh.
if you were able to somehow encapsulate that and stick it in a CD or write it in a book,
uh-huh.
somebody else could take that data without ever seeing red, process that data, and then experience red or seen red. Like it'd be horrible, but
I don't think that's right. So wait. Depends on how they're playing it back. So when they got this, so okay, you take a person who's not in the room,
Yeah.
you show them a red apple, and you record their whole neurological experience,
yeah.
and then that's on a
Yeah, like
let's call it a Blu-ray. Okay, yeah, it's on a USB key, and then I plug that into my computer. Or sorry, Mary plugs that into her computer, and she's looking at the Excel spreadsheet with all the data. Is that the same as having seen red for her?
I'm not saying that. Like you have to load it back into that person's head.
You have to show them red.
If you take out that data from their head and then stick it on USB, you have to then stick that data back into another person's head.
Stick it in how? Stick it in
I
how?
don't know, shove needles into their brain.
Oh my god. Okay, so the question is, does she get the relevant information by any other means than having seen red? And it doesn't really matter whether it's like there's a red object in her environment, or you can see colors just by like pushing on your eyeballs or dreaming or whatever. The assumption is that she's never experienced red, and the question is, does she get all of the knowledge about it without ever having experienced it, or doesn't she? That's the fulcrum of this. Yeah, yeah.
Like, wouldn't it be? I don't think that would like discount seeing red as a physical property. It's just a physical property of Mary, not of the color red.
Okay, so.
So like it would mention like neural synapses
Mhm.
firing a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a physical property of Mary, and if she knew everything there was to know, even if she hasn't felt it, she would know the consequences
Oh yeah.
of those feelings.
So when she goes out of the room and sees red for the first time, she could give you a neuron by neuron account of what's happening in her head. But she could have done that before she left the room. So it's not that she's learning anything new about color vision as a physical process. But the assumption of the thought experiment is she already knows all that stuff. So like, okay, so it's a property of her rather than redness.
Yes,
And that
so-
sounds right. But isn't it a mental property of her?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Her feeling is she knows that seeing red has a mental property associated with it, even if she hasn't felt it herself.
Yep, that's right.
So you can say that she went out and now she feels something new. She's gained new knowledge,
Yep.
but it isn't necessarily knowledge that
It's
she
not
didn't know before.
it's not non-physical knowledge in some sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
So the question is whether she learned something.
That's right.
Well then, I think you can say that she also didn't learn something, because you can say the argument that learning is also subjective in a way where it's basically our own sort of sense of greed and sort of self-fulfillment, I guess, to say it in a narcissistic way. I mean, you feel like you learned something when you reach a certain capacity, but that capacity is subjective to whoever you can be.
So
You learned all about vision and all about the color red, in a way that's done by textbooks and stuff.
yeah.
That's a certain threshold of learning that you have achieved. So you can't necessarily say that you've gone above and beyond that, because you didn't really have to. You want to, but you didn't have to.
So like we can formulate this without using the word learn. So if the worry is that you can have the feeling of learning without really learning, you can formulate this without using the word learn. You could say, did she acquire new knowledge? Presumably having knowledge is at least somewhat grounded in the world, right? So I have knowledge, typically we say I have knowledge if I have a justified true belief. So am I justified? That's not subjective, that's a fact about it, a fact of the matter. Is it true? That's definitely a fact of the matter. So being justified and true seem like non-subjective qualities of the beliefs. And so we can say, did she gain any new justified true beliefs when she left the room and sees red for the first time? And that seems to be there's a fact about that rather than it being merely. So learning, and I know we talked about the TED Talk experience where you're like, it feels like I'm learning so much, and you're not. But maybe formulating this in terms of knowledge is more helpful. Okay, let's before we exhaust this entirely, because I think we're going to come back to this and some related arguments next time. So let's let this stew for a while. But this is the kind of argument that the people who defend property dualism use. And we kind of touched on this. So here's a philosophical term of art that I would like you to acquire: qualia. So qualia are the subjective experience of things, like the redness of red or the greenness of green. And it's very exciting. It's a philosophical view that is rediscovered by teenagers high on cannabis every year. Every year. What if what I see as red is actually what you see as green? And what they're discovering is the idea that the qualia, so we can publicly check whether when I point to something and go red, I'm pointing to the same basic thing as you would if when you point to something and go red, right? That's something that we can check against each other. What we can't check is whether the content of your experience is the same, right? So maybe the redness of red for me, and the redness of red is what we call the qualia of red. Qualia, by the way, is plural. The singular is quail, but nobody ever says quail. We always just say qualia. Anyway, so another quick argument for property dualism comes from this guy, David Chalmers, and it's the zombie argument. This is weird stuff, but so imagine a person identical in literally every way to another person, except that they have no subjective experience. For them, there's nothing that it's like to see red. There's nothing that it's like to feel pain. They behave as though they do. They act as though they're having subjective experiences, but by assumption of the thought experiment, they are not, in fact. We'll call them a philosophical zombie. Now, probably you don't believe that there are any actual philosophical zombies running around, but can you imagine that? Okay. If you can imagine that, then Chalmers says you should be a dualist. Because if you can conceive of somebody behaving identically to, so there's another version of me. We copy me, there's another me, there's a Corey right beside me. I have subjective experience. This other Corey doesn't. But nonetheless, this other Corey acts exactly the same as me. If you can conceive of that, then what you can conceive of is a difference between, there is not an essential connection between having my body and having subjective experience. So there's no essential connection between the physical and the mental in the sense of, so the other Corey can do cognition in a lot of senses, right? They can do math. Insofar as I can do math, which is not that much, that Corey can do math. The other Corey can like write papers and do stuff, right? So all the cognitive stuff that I can do, the other Corey can do as well. What the other Corey is not having is inner subjective conscious experience. Now, if that's possible, if that's conceivable, Chalmers says, then we should believe that what follows is that there's no necessary connection between the physical aspects of a person and the mental aspects. Therefore, because if something is necessary, if there's no necessary connection between A and B, then A and B are not identical. Therefore, A and B are not identical. That is, minds and bodies are not the same. Yeah?
Maybe I'm having a hard time what he means by conceive of, but like that sounds like, can you conceive of a unicorn? Cool, you need to believe in unicorns. Yeah.
Okay.
Like maybe you can conceive of it, you think this is something that is possible if you're a dualist.
Yeah.
But that sort of is just like, if you believe in dualism, you can be a dualist. Then I'm just giving you a word for what you believe.
Right, right. I find it very easy to conceive of unicorns. Actually, the internet has pointed out to me that they're much more, if somebody said to you, here's a unicorn and here's a giraffe, which one do you think exists? The unicorn is much more plausible, right? Okay, so, but it's not, so the argument is not quite that. So it's not, if you can imagine unicorns, then they exist, even though that would be great. That's not what he's saying. So what he's saying is, if you can imagine a they call him a P-zombie, a philosophical zombie. If you can conceive of that, then they are in some broad sense possible. So they're logically possible or metaphysically possible. Not even physically possible. So it doesn't have to be even consistent with the laws of physics. He's not saying it's physically possible. He's claiming that it's logically or metaphysically possible, which is to say that there is no necessary connection between mental properties and physical properties. Even if, as a matter of the facts of the world, there are always these correlations. So anytime you've got like the right kind of brain and the right kind of body and the right kind of experience, you have mental properties. As a metaphysical fact, you didn't have to, which tells us that they're not, the essence of physical things and the essence of mental things are not identical. That's the argument. Believe me, just as a reminder, we're doing philosophy now, so there is no consensus about any of this. I'm not trying to convince you of any of these things. I'm just trying to explain the arguments. So I am not endorsing Chalmers, by the way. I'm just trying to give you the argument. Yeah.
I think his assumption is really not possible because for your clone to be able to write papers like you,
Yeah.
like like at the human intelligence level of quality,
Yep.
you would also need some sort of subjective experience to be able to come up with new ideas and new things to think of.
So good. So that's one way of responding to Chalmers. If you don't like this argument, one way of responding is to say, you know, I can conceive of it in the same way that I can conceive of a square circle. Like I can entertain it in some very broad sense, but that doesn't mean that I believe that it's possible. And the way to deny this, and the way we're going to sort of explore this is, you know, maybe consciousness is not just an extra added on that does nothing. Maybe consciousness, subjective experience, is for something. If it's for something, if it does something for you biologically, then no, you can't imagine another version of me that does all the stuff that I do. If I'm relying on conscious experience for some part of the way that I get through the world, then no, in some more careful sense. So he's got a kind of breezy connection. This is one of the ways that philosophers have been criticizing him. He says, I can conceive of it in the sense that, yeah, I can broadly imagine it because I'm good at imagining things. But maybe that doesn't mean that it's possible in the right sense, because it's not possible because consciousness, subjective experience, it's important to us. It does something for us. Nature didn't just give us this for no reason. It's got a function. So then you have to ask the question, what's the function of consciousness? What's it for? Yeah.
I'm not answering that question.
Okay. Another topic. That's good.
But just like as soon as you first presented like the thought of somebody who is like behaves like you the same way you might,
Mm-hmm.
like to me that just presents no human being who is sociopathic. Or has like, you know, like social personality disorders where they literally can't connect to what they do and they
Yep.
can't remember what they perform. And,
Yep.
You know, so they don't create that. I can't remember the word that you've used 7 times.
It's late in the lecture. Yeah.
They can't remember. They don't have subjective experience.
Subjective experience. Yeah.
They physically can't. They
Yep.
can't process it. They can't hold it, and they can't remember it. The fact
Yeah.
that they can write an essay doesn't mean that they didn't learn.
Right.
You know,
Right.
learning the language is learning the language. But
Right.
being able to utilize and structure things in a way that, you know, they mean something
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah.
It's a differentiation between like, you know, or do you understand the action that you're performing?
Right.
Or are you just performing
Yep.
the action because that's what the world is
Yep.
wanting
So
you to do?
the thought is that there might be people who pass the Turing test, but who are not having conscious experience. There's a really good book called Blindsight, which explores this thought, where the protagonist has no inner subjective experience. But the thing is, so the difference between that and this is Chalmers is asking you to imagine somebody who, so I take it that, so let's just imagine that like there's some severe form of sociopathy where they're not having subjective experience. The thing about that is that they act differently, right? So there's behavioral differences that you can detect, right? Whereas Chalmers is asking us to imagine somebody who's just completely identical. So to anybody, to me or you, right? So their behavior is indistinguishable in any possible way from a person who's got subjective experience. Any input that you could give to the person with subjective experience, the philosophical zombie would act exactly the same. That's what he needs. So he needs it to be very, very strong identity. It can't be the case that for somebody without a subjective experience, they like don't get why people like music, and they're kind of like, oh, you know, paintings doesn't really do it for me or something like that. Those would be behavioral differences that would be like, yeah, okay, so now we can imagine, so somebody without conscious subjective experience, if they act differently, then that means that consciousness is playing some causal role for them. And so if that's the case, then this doesn't work, right? So for Chalmers, it's got to be a really strong identity of behavior such that there'd be no test you could perform that would tell them differently. They'd have no differences in preferences or interests or any of that stuff. Yeah.
Overarching, but like, why do we need to have either strictly physical, like minds, rest, you know, in essence, physical reality, or equals? Why can't we have both?
Both which?
Like, why can't we have both dualism in some scenarios? areas or in some cases, and why can't we then have physically nested minds and other pieces? Why can't we have both sides of the question?
I'm open to the idea of a hybrid ontology, but I'd need to see the details. Yeah. Okay. One more way of putting this. So here's Saul Kripke giving basically the same question, basically the same idea. So imagine God's creating the universe. Having fixed all the physical facts, so he's put together how our brains are going to work, how our bodies are going to work, is there any more work God needs to do to make it such that we have vivid inner subjective experience? And if you say no, then you're a physicalist. You say the physical facts are enough. You don't have to say anything more. If you say, yeah, God's got to add in subjective, once all the physical facts are there, God's then furthermore got to add in the subjective experience bit, then you're a dualist. You're a property dualist of some sort. So this is just basically another way of putting the same debate. And this is just sort of a diagnostic. Okay. And this all kind of hangs on this question of physicalism and reduction. So physicalism is the view that the universe is just matter in motion, right? There's no other kind of stuff. Reductionism is the idea that the best way of explaining anything is to understand its parts. So the property dualist rejects reductionism in a really profound way, in an ontological way, right? So there's things that are simply inexplicable in terms of their parts. Not just because it's not as good of a story, but just because it's fundamentally impossible to reduce them to their parts. Okay, so this is the kind of stakes of the debate. We're asking, if we're physicalists, if we believe that there's just matter in motion, do we then also subscribe to reductionism, and in what way? That's the kind of thing that we're going to keep exploring, and let's keep exploring it next time. We've done a lot today, so next time we're going to talk a little bit more about dualism and then a couple of other isms, idealism and physicalism. All right.